what we recently witnessed was a clear demonstration of barbarism and unprofessionalism by the Chinese Coast Guard in the lawful waters of a sovereign country, right? So this was a criminal act, an act of piracy being perpetrated by a state actor. While our brave hearts did what they could, to push back, they were clearly outnumbered by the Chinese forces who were carrying bladed equipment as well. We also have to realize that the Chinese Coast Guard continues to insist on playing football, in a basketball game. It has no regard for rules or professionalism. It is trained to act savagely in such scenarios, which is contrary to how a Coast Guard must act. More importantly, contrary to the recent play of a victim card by Beijing a few days back, it is clear that China is pursuing active escalation, to handle its conflict of interest with the Philippines. So the idea here is to bend Manila's reinvigorated political will, to tarnish the legitimacy of the U.S.-Philippine alliance, and of course to lower the morale of the military, all in ways that are against international law.
Well, obviously the Philippines are not happy about this, with the military chief calling it, as you mentioned, China's actions have been labelled as piracy. What is the Philippines now demanding, and how is Beijing likely to respond to that?
Well, within the past year alone, we have witnessed China normalizing its escalatory activities part by part. So from increasing the frequency of ramming to increasing the frequency of water cannoning resupply ships. So this is the third or fourth instance when a Filipino crew member was badly injured, right? As it feels that, as long as China feels that the strategic benefits outweigh the strategic cost, it is likely to push further, to normalize what we just saw the past few days. So, while we have learned from this recent lesson, it will be necessary to adapt and to recalibrate our options, But of course, this is easier said than done at the operational level. So perhaps we could look into equipping Filipino crew members with non-lethal weapons, providing them with training to act on such scenarios at sea, right? China is perhaps waiting for us to fire the first shot. The Philippines can work around this by exploring options to push back in a way that would demonstrate physical deterrence, because clearly that is what would apply more cost to China's activities. But of course, this is something that we also need to explore with our ally and with our partners. We've seen a recent phone call between Secretary Manalo and Secretary Blinken. So they are probably discussing these very aspects as well. But clearly what we can see here is that China is pushing the red line, inching closer to the red line, which President Marcos Jr. had laid out at the Shangri-La dialogue. So, it is to develop, that physical deterrence, I believe, that would be crucial at this point.
Well, when you talk about that red line, how close are we to it? As you said, Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has said he fears a single incident in the territorial waters could spark a wider conflict. What would that incident look like?
Well, absolutely. So what we can see is that there were efforts to define the red line loosely. It started off with identifying any form of armed attack in the South China Sea, for instance, and particularly the West Philippine Sea, which is the Philippines encompassing the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. But in the Shangri-La dialogue, President Marcos stated that if there was a crew member or any Filipino killed at this point, that would immediately trigger that mutual defense clause in the MDT. So what we are seeing now is that China is trying to test how far it could go in provoking the Philippines, as it tries to inch closer towards that red line. But then again, if it feels that the risks are, again, not as much as the strategic benefit, it is likely for Beijing to push the envelope. So I think that I have mentioned earlier, this is a crucial moment for the Philippines, and not just the Philippines, but the rest of like-minded countries as well in the Indo-Pacific. China has demonstrated that alone it has the capability to disrupt what we call the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. So this is something that we would need to address very seriously.
How is Bongbong Marcos taking on the threat that China poses in the region in the 2 years that he's already been leading the country now? What's your assessment?
Well, we have to understand that in the initial portion of the ongoing Marcos Jr. administration, the Philippines clearly reached out to Beijing. It is in our best interest, obviously, to have good relations with our most powerful and largest immediate neighbor. And this was, of course, the reason for the January 2023 meeting in Beijing between both leaders. But unfortunately, a few weeks after that, we've seen that level of escalation in the West Philippine Sea, from the laser shooting to many more rammings and water cannon incidents. And of course, like any proactive leader, President Marcos Jr. was quick to realize that China is unwilling to mend its narrowly driven ambitions in the region. But it has maintained a very defense-oriented position. The military and the Coast Guard of the Philippines have maintained that level of professionalism, which unfortunately is considered the exact opposite of what Chinese Coast Guard vessels have been demonstrating in the past few months. But of course, as the pressure ramps up, Manila would be forced to recalibrate its options, obviously. But at the same time, there is that consistency ensuring that the Philippine position is to that of defending what is left of the status quo based on international law rather than provoking it. But of course, this seems to be ignored by Beijing. And as we can see, it has this tendency of altering the narrative. But I think it has gone far beyond, for that ability to alter the narrative to its favor, as everything is clear. Everything is crystal clear as to what's happening. Now, the next thing that we need to discuss is, how to apply more cost to China's activities, to restrain its activities in the West Philippine Sea. But it is likely for it to push further if it feels that there is that lack of cost being applied on it.
Well, we'll definitely wait and see and watch very closely. Don McLain Gill, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much.